Hello everyone, and thank you for stopping in. My name is Ayman and this is Success with Chess Saves Lives. If you are here, I am thankful for it. I hope that I can give you the opportunity to learn chess at a more successful rate than some of the other sites that are out there. This video series is for people that have absolutely no idea how to play chess. I mentioned that in my first video. So if you know how to play chess or know how the pieces move and how, what checkmate looks like, then this video series isn't for you. This video series is for people that have absolutely no knowledge of what chess is about and really need that extra help in order to understand it. Okay, in saying that, I have had people ask me, what's with the mask? And the reason for the mask, it really is symbolic of what's going on out there. And we need to be proactive and cautious when we are going around people. So I'm wearing that for that reason specifically. Um, the second reason, though, wearing it is because I have a little bit of processing issues and some self-esteem issues, so I feel more comfortable with it on, and I hope that's okay with you guys. So regarding the pawn, we're going to concern ourselves with basically four things about the pawn: how a pawn moves, how a pawn attacks, promotion, and en passant. Okay, we're going to knock each of those out one at a time, and by the end of the lesson, you will have a full understanding of how pawns operate. Okay, so let's go ahead and we'll get into the lesson immediately. Okay, so if you look down here on white's second rank, we have all pawns in a row. Black's seventh rank has all his pawns. This is known as home base for the pawns. So how does a pawn move? Okay, here's how a pawn moves. On its very first move, a pawn can move either one square or the pawn can move two squares. It's completely up to you. From this home base here, the pawn can, again, move one square or it can move two squares. And I'm talking about any one of these pawns, okay, from home base. From their starting position, they are allowed to move one square or two squares. Okay, so let's suppose I move this one square, I move this one two squares, I move this one square, maybe this one two squares, okay? Once I leave home row, whether it's one square up or two squares up, after that, I am only allowed to move the pawn one square at a time forward, okay? These over here, I haven't moved them, so I can choose to move one square with this one, or I could have moved it two if I wanted. But remember that after I move it off of its home row, I can only move one square at a time. So the second rule regarding pawns that we want to look at is how does a pawn attack? Okay, a pawn attacks diagonal, and that's it. So for example, if white makes a move two squares up, and then black decides to make a move two squares up, he is directly diagonal from white. So if white wants to, white can go ahead and he can just diagonally capture that pawn. Now the pawn must be directly diagonal from the opposing pawn in order to capture it, and it must be your turn. So after black made his move, it was white's move, and white could capture if indeed he chooses to. Let's just say black moves his pawn here after white moves to d4. White right now cannot capture this pawn, although even though it is diagonal from white, he still can't capture, because the reason is the piece that the pawn captures diagonally must be right next diagonal right next to the opposing pawn. Okay, so he white or any pawn cannot capture another piece when there are squares between them diagonally. Another rule involving the pawn is called pawn promotion. Now, what is pawn promotion? It means that you or the opposing person gets one of their pawns to your back rank. They can promote that pawn to either a queen, a rook, a knight, or a bishop. You cannot promote to another king, and you cannot promote to an, or leave it as a pawn. Okay, it must change. Okay, it's like a chrysalis, right? It's a butterfly effect. So you want to be able to realize and know and understand that when you promote a pawn, it can only be either a queen, a rook, a knight, or a bishop. Okay? A king cannot be, you cannot have two kings on the board and the pawn must promote. So it is one of these pieces that you must promote to. And later on, we'll talk more about what piece is important to promote and what pieces you should be staying away from when you promote. Because promoting could either be hurtful or it can be helpful. And we'll look at those situations later on as we continue. But for right now, just know that when you do promote, it must be one of these four pieces that we just talked about. So in order for you to promote a pawn, the first thing you need to do is you need to get it, again, to the person's back rank. So that means black would have to try to get one of his pawns to my back rank here, which is rank number 1. And I'm trying to get one of my pawns back to black's back rank, which is rank number 8, in order to promote. Okay, so let's take a look at a possible scenario of how you can get one of your pawns to promote using the rules I just taught you so far. Okay, so let's just make a move here. Let's suppose white moves his pawn up 2 squares. And black decides he's going to move his pawn up 2 squares. Now, because pawns only attack diagonally, these two are basically stuck. They cannot go anywhere. And pawns cannot move backwards. Again, pawns cannot move backwards. They only move forwards unless they're attacking. So if there was a piece over here, for example, like this pawn right here could capture. But that's not the case right now. So we're going to look at what the case is, and this is the case right now. This is the position. So black moves his pawn here to e5. Now white can decide to maybe push this pawn up. And if he does that, black can just capture if he wants to. So that's not necessarily what we want to do with this pawn here that I moved up. The first thing I want to do so that he doesn't take me for free is I'm going to put this pawn right here, so that on my next move, I can just go ahead and throw this pawn up. So then if he takes me, I have this pawn here to protect, and I take back, and I am central, okay, in the board. Now, why do I want to be central? These 4 squares right here, okay, d5, e5, e4, and d4, are really the critical squares that you want to control in chess. Always remember that, and always practice so that your pawns or your pieces always end up guarding or controlling these squares right here. Okay, so let's suppose after these are the moves that were made, and black goes ahead and he does something like this. Now, white has a couple of options. He actually has 3 options from this position. The first option is he can just take, right? That's what he can do. The second option he has is that he can put this pawn sorry about that, he can put this pawn up here so that if black captures here, white can recapture right there. All right, that's a possibility. Okay, that's a possibility. Now, white may also decide, instead of bringing this pawn up or attacking, he can decide to do one final thing, and that is pass him up. Okay, so by simply passing him up, we've avoided the confrontation, and actually, in my opinion, have done better because we've advanced this pawn closer to the enemy's back rank. Okay, so let's suppose white does this move and he passes him up, and then black does this. So what are our options now? We have the same options, right? We can either attack, we can either defend, or we can move forward. Now remember what the objective is. The objective is to get one of our pawns to the person's back rank. From this position, it is white's turn. How are we going to do that? So let's take a look. Again, if I want to, I can defend by putting this pawn here, because now if he takes me, I can choose to either take with this pawn or this pawn. Okay, I can do that. Or if he decides, if I decide to, I can just pass him up, or I can attack. So out of those three things, which one do you think is going to benefit white? If you said pass him up, you are absolutely correct, and here's why. As soon as we pass him up, when we were at this square and went up to this square, there is nothing, there are no pawns around that are going to be able to stop us from simply getting up here to the top and promoting to a queen, a rook, a bishop, or a knight. Okay, so black made a big mistake, and we were able to capitalize on it. Okay, let's take a look at this position. It's white's move right now. Which pawn do you think that white can move or attack with or defend that will benefit white from this position? Take a look closely. Remember, we want to get our pawn up to the person's back rank. Give you a second. Okay, the answer is this. The answer is right here. The pawn on e4 will take f5. And now, because pawns don't take side to side, they only attack diagonal, and they can't move backwards, white can now just safely go on up and promote his pawn. Okay, I think you have a pretty good idea of how pawns promote. So far we've covered how a pawn moves, how a pawn attacks, and how a pawn promotes. So the final thing I want to talk about in relation to pawns is called en passant. And en passant is a very special rule in chess regarding pawns only. Okay, only pawns. And the word en passant comes from the French for in passing. And everything I just taught you about pawns is like going to be thrown out the window. But remember, it is a special move, and it really doesn't happen very often, but when it does, you definitely want to be prepared in order to navigate through it and in order to make the best move. And so let's go ahead and take a look at what en passant is and how to utilize it. Okay, so in order for en passant to be exercised or to be initiated, there are three criteria that have to be met first. And the first one is this. In order for you or the opponent to do an en passant, you must be, or they must be, either or, on the opposing person's fourth rank. So let's take a look at what that looks like. If you can see here, black has 4 pawns on white's fourth rank. Okay, so that first criteria is met in order for en passant to occur. The second criteria that has to be present in order for en passant to happen is that the person that is moving, in this case it's white's turn to move, must move up 2 squares and be side by side with the opposing pawn in order for en passant to occur. Again, they must start off at their home base. That's the number 1 rule. And then the second thing is they must move up 2 squares from that home base and be side by side with the pawn that's on the fourth rank in order for it to happen. So here's what black can do. In this situation, in fact, he is on the fourth rank. In fact, white was on his home row before he moved up 2 squares and was side by side with black. So black can do this. Again, very special rule in chess. He can actually take this pawn and just come down to that empty square and remove that pawn from the equation. Okay, remove him from the board. So let's watch that again and see if we can get this right. Okay, he started off on his home row. He moved up 2 squares and he passed them. Let's go over here and try it from over here. This pawn hasn't moved, so just suppose I move this pawn up 2 squares. Now, this is a special case because here we moved up 2 squares from our initial home base, and we are in fact side by side with 2 black pawns that are on the fourth rank. Now, if black wanted to, he could en passant white. Now, here's the thing. He can en passant with either the pawn on f4, or he can en passant with the pawn, oops, sorry about that. So black can en passant with either the pawn on f4, or he can en passant with the pawn on d4. And he can choose either one, but again, when we get better at chess, we're going to look at which moves are going to benefit you in terms of position. So from this position, again, if black wants to, he can just simply take this pawn and pass the pawn on e4 up and just remove him from the board. Okay, he can do it like that. Now, black can also take this pawn and do an en passant with the pawn on f4 and remove that white pawn as well. So it's up to you, and it's also very important that you make a decision as to which piece to take with, because, and I'll say this again over and over again, if you can take with 10 different pieces, you need to know which piece it is that you're taking with that is going to benefit your position. Okay, I'm going to keep reiterating these things so that it becomes habit for you, mentally. So let's go ahead and take a look at another position. Okay, from this position, if it's white's turn and white does a move like this, for example, and he brings that white pawn up to g4. In fact, he is side by side right now with the enemy pawns that are on his fourth rank, correct? Okay, but can they en passant right now, if you remember the rules? The answer is no, and here's why. Even though they are side by side with each other, the fact of the matter remains is that white did not start off on his home base. He already started off on g3. He had already moved that pawn, and when he went up to go 1 square up, just because he's simply side by side doesn't mean that they can do an en passant. If white started off on his home row and then went up 2 squares, absolutely, he can definitely en passant from that position. we can see from this angle, from this side, after we flip the board, that white now is in black's territory and on black's fourth rank. Now, I know that you're looking at this and you're saying, wait a minute, how could this be black's fourth rank when it clearly says this is the fifth rank? Here's the answer to that. If you take a look at the chessboard, even though this says the fifth rank, it is white's fifth rank. It is not black's fifth rank, because if you started off back here and on any one of these files and count that as black's number one square, because it really is black's number one. Even though it says eighth rank, it's still black's first, because if we count up 1, 2, 3, and then 4, we see now that in fact that square is black's fourth rank. It's white's fifth rank, but black's fourth rank. Okay, the same rules apply if if black on his very first move makes 2 square jump, he is in fact side by side with white. And if white wants to, he can en passant. He can use this pawn to en passant, or he can use this pawn to en passant if he chooses. White may not want to en passant. White may want to pass him up, and that's perfectly fine too. Again, it just depends on the situation. It depends on the position. In saying that, what I need you to know is that when you are confronted with an opportunity to do an en passant, whether or not you decide to do it is completely up to you. But just know this: if you do not choose to exercise the en passant immediately, right after it happens, you cannot do it anymore. So if, for example, if black moves up 2 squares here and white has an opportunity to do an en passant and he doesn't, instead maybe he brings his pawn down, that's it. Even this pawn cannot do an en passant on its next move. White loses his opportunity to do an en passant. Well, I hope this lesson on en passant taught you something. I think that it's very important to know what all of the pieces do and what they're capable of doing, and in what positions that they're capable of doing it in. So hopefully those things are sticking with you. And if you need to re-watch the video, please do so. If you haven't done so yet, please visit my website at chesssaveslives.com so that you can get more of an understanding as to what I'm trying to do and how I'm trying to help. Thank you so much, and until next time, take care and stay safe out there.